Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Tobias Jesso Jr, titled Goon. But before we begin, let's talk a little bit about one of the most common song templates in modern music. The piano ballad. Long held up as one of the most basic, but yes, most versatile setups in the industry, it's a formula that's almost classic, and can be played in many different forms. The crowning era of this, as it was for many singer-songwriters, that was the 70s, where the piano could be soft and intimate, or clattering and loud. Now, as a pianist myself, albeit one with not much subtlety, there's a certain affinity I have to very, very good piano ballads for their ability to craft intricate melodies and grooves with every single note. I really like them. But it seems as time has gone by, the piano ballads that get popular these days are more maudlin and subdued, where our singer-songwriter goes to the piano because he wants to evoke an atmosphere of downbeat simplicity and nothing else. This really came to a head in the first half of 2013, where we were deluged with piano ballads that weren't bad, but rarely had the songwriting heft to really grip me. Sure, I like sad love and breakup songs as much as anybody, but there's more to the formula and stories that could have been told beyond that and just weren't there in 2013. And it can fall along a similar line of the opinion I tend to hold of white guys with acoustic guitars. If you can't elevate the bare minimum into something of more substance or emotive weight beyond the very most basics, it's kind of hard for me to connect with it, simply because I've seen so much of it done before and oftentimes done better. Now, this is one of the big reasons that I've been kind of leery about checking out the debut album from Canadian singer-songwriter Tobias Jesso Jr. Originally starting as a bassist in LA for several years, Jesso eventually moved back to Vancouver, and after a particularly rough breakup and some family difficulties, he started working on this album and sending out his demos. From there, Jesso was able to leverage some pretty interesting connections. J.R. White, formerly of the duo Girls, Ariel Reichstad, John Collins and New Pornographers, and most interestingly for me, Pat Carney of the Black Keys. He also managed to enlist help from one of the sisters from Haim, and wow, it seems like this guy hit the lottery when it comes to critically beloved friends in indie rock. And from everything that I had heard going into this record, I wasn't going to be getting the hyper-literate or intricate songs of someone like Josh Tillman, but something more simpler and more emotive. And you know what, that can work. Perfume Genius proved that on his earlier albums. So I decided to give Tobias Jesso Jr. a chance with his debut album, perplexingly titled Goon. So, how is it? Well, I gotta say, I'm underwhelmed. Actually, that's probably being polite. For an album that's gotten a lot of comparisons to Randy Newman, Harry Nilsson, and even Paul McCartney, Tobias Jesso Jr.'s Goon plays in the Bush League at best. An emotionally underweight trifle that tries to run on simplicity and instead runs on fumes. If stripping things down to the piano ballad is all about making every single element of the song work at its best in lyrics and delivery and composition, the closest this record gets to passable is in the instrumentation and production, which is pretty good. It's not even an interesting failure or curiosity of a record, it's just painfully basic and unimpressive. In other words, while it's not bad, I have a hard time calling this anything close to good. So admittedly, those are some pretty harsh accusations. So before I get to those, let's talk about the one element that does mostly work: the instrumentation and the production. I'll say this for Jesso, there's a certain charm to sticking to the absolute basics. And it's very clear he does have a knack for some pretty decent melodic hooks. Now sure, we're not getting extensive classical digressions or moments that show off mind-blowing talent on the keys, but simplicity can work to your favor if you add enough to it. And there are some moments where Jesso really does, even if it does feel a little bit like he's building off the framework of the past, particularly in the 70s, and most egregiously on the opening track, Can't Stop Thinking About You, which does share a very similar chord pattern to the old Cheers theme song. But going past that, there were elements of the production and instrumentation that I really did like. Even though the lyrics completely sink the song How Could You Babe, it has a good enough framework in the gentle organ tones, then you have the slightly faded strings accents and Can We Still Be Friends, the bright bounciness of For You, with slightly more prominent drums, and the slightly more aggressive and crisp Crocodile Tears, the distant echo of the percussion. On the other hand, stuff like the horns on the outro of Hollywood are some of the most unflattering and limp attempts at that sort of ending that I've heard in a long time. And while I get the song is focused more on failed LA dreams and the horns might accent that, there's a difference between wistful and lonely and just sputtering incompetence. And on that note, we might as well talk about lyrics and themes. Now, I've already said that the songwriting is pretty thin. You get your troubled relationship songs, a lot of heartbreak and autobiography, and it's all sketched so broad with so little detail that could easily be applied to anyone. We're not so much getting character vignettes on this album as slices of very personalized emotion that can relate to everybody. I'd say that, but the more I listened through this album, the more lyrics started to come across as, well, a little whiny and a little insufferable. And it starts off very early, where Jesso admits he treated this girl badly, which led to the breakup, and yet, since it's been so long, he he's now scared to apologize? Why? Doesn't time tend to mean that old hurts tend to fade away? Wouldn't this be a good thing if you're pleading for her to come back to you? Or go on to the next song, where it seems like the breakup is handled maturely until she finds a new guy, potentially the love of her life, and Jesso plays it all like a huge betrayal, plainly not over any of it. Or the incessant and overwrought whining of "without you," or the pleas for forgiveness that rings so hollow on bad words, or the demands that her just be honest and dump him already and tell the truth. It rings so petty and immature and childish. It makes songs that actually do have a little bit more sense, like the forgiveness on "Can We Still Be Friends," feel like exceptions instead of the rule. Now, you could argue this sort of relationship behavior, it's intentional, creating a very flawed protagonist that we can respect for his fragile humanity, perhaps evidenced by Jesso calling this album Goon, implying that his protagonist isn't all that much of a good person. Hell, there are fragments of that on For You, where it seems like our narrator will be there when times are good and little else. Or on Crocodile Tears, where he's just going through the motions in a failing relationship and just needs to end it already. But you know what, there's a few problems with that conclusion, and it's mostly linked to the songwriting. The first issue is simple enough. When your writing is so bare bones and lacking in additional detail, not to mention drenched in cliched topics and execution, there's rarely enough additional context to explain why we should empathize with this protagonist, or why his flawed behavior is justifiable. Now, sure, I get his feelings, but the delivery is often so earnest and yearning that we as the audience are supposed to empathize with him, and it's hard for me to do that when he can come across like such a dick on this record. And the second issue comes down to the performance, because if you go back to that golden era of singer-songwriters, the guys who could write simple songs and really touch our hearts, it oftentimes came down to the performance. You could buy the weary sadness in Paul McCartney's voice on songs like Yesterday, for instance. So what about Tobias Jesso Jr.? Well, I admit this will come down to personal taste, but I get nothing from this guy. I mean, I get there's a purpose to understatement and keeping things subtle, but when you pair it with songwriting compositions that are so basic, there needs to be something about the vocal delivery that really stands out, and nothing does to me. And the frustrating thing is, I don't doubt his emotions are authentic, but his thin croon reminds me a lot less of Nilsson or Newman or Paul McCartney, and more of when John Travolta tried to play the teen idol crowd in the mid-70s. Just does not impress me here. The voice audibly cracks when he stretches it to bring more passion, his dramatic range feels forced at best, and masking the flaws behind multi-tracking and filters don't help matters, and only further distance us from him as the audience, and that's a problem. And it's not flaws that enrich the performance either. Going back to an act like Perfume Genius, the vocal flaws and breaks were a lot more audible and a lot more egregious, but there was an inner core of strength and real inner potency to his delivery that Tobias Jesso Jr. just does not have. What's worse here is that there's not that sort of complicated emotive delivery that you need to back up tracks with self-aware, flawed narrators that you find with stronger singer-songwriters like, say, Josh Tillman or James McMurtry or Bill Callahan. It feels less organically flawed and more just amateurishly unpolished, something that I could hear in any lounge or piano bar in the country, and as such, I don't really connect with it all that well. So in short, I don't think this album is bad. As I said, hell, I completely get its appeal. If you're a fan of Tobias Jesso Jr.'s crooning and you think his penchant for simple songs is charming, you'll like this album. But when I compare this to piano ballads like The Other Guy by Jesse McCartney or Conclusions by Frank Music, or go a little bit broader here, Someone Like You by Adele, which featured incredibly raw vocals that fit the complicated material in their songs and worked incredibly well, or the extreme lyrical stylings of Josh Tillman in his most recent record, his Father John Misty, or even the virtuoso pianist talents of John Legend at his best on songs like Ordinary People, Goon by Tobias Jesso Jr., it feels like a pale imitation. It feels like something that could have more power, but going for that universality, but spreading itself so thin to feel like a facsimile of better work, even if his emotions are real. For me, I'm sorry, it's a strong 5 out of 10 at best. I hate to say it, but if you can't nail this simple formula, sometimes it's better to aim for something more. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I'm a little bit late on this album, and kind of sorry that I did cover it. I'm expecting I'm gonna get a little bit of hate for this, but it happens. But until then, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.